Welcome to my channel, the place where history comes alive. Today, we're diving into one of the most incredible untold stories of World War II, the Ghost Army. This was a secret US unit made up of artists, designers, and sound engineers who didn't fight with guns, but with illusion, deception, and creativity, saving countless lives along the way. Before we jump in, make sure to hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications so you never miss a story that changes the way you see history. World War II, a conflict that consumed the globe from 1939 to 1945. Nations clashed with tanks, planes, artillery, and millions of soldiers. It was a war of brute force, of blood and steel. But not every victory was won with bullets. Some were won with illusions. Hidden deep in the shadows of history, there existed a secret American unit, a unit unlike any other in the war. Its members were not hardened fighters, but painters, designers, actors, sound engineers, and set creators. Men trained not in destruction, but in deception. Their mission? To trick the Nazis into seeing what wasn't there, to create entire armies out of thin air, and to save countless lives, not by firing weapons, but by confusing the enemy into fighting phantoms. They were called many things over the decades, but today we know them as the Ghost Army. Imagine this: you're a German scout in France in 1944. Through your binoculars, you see dozens of American Sherman tanks positioned in a field. You hear the rumble of engines, the clank of armored tracks, and the chatter of soldiers' radios. You quickly report back to headquarters. An enemy armored division is massing for attack. The German command shifts resources, preparing to face this American force. But there's one problem. Those tanks, they're nothing more than inflatable rubber decoys. The engine sounds, recordings, blasted through massive speakers, the radio chatter, actors pretending to be generals. You haven't discovered a powerful US division. You've walked into the theater of war, directed by the Ghost Army. This unit was officially known as the 23rd Headquarters Special Troops, a top-secret group of around 1,100 men. From 1944 to 1945, they carried out more than 20 deception missions across Europe. They made the Germans believe American forces were in one place, while the real troops were preparing for attacks miles away. By doing so, they misled the enemy, drew fire away from actual soldiers, and in some cases, changed the course of battles. What made the Ghost Army extraordinary wasn't just their tactics, it was who they were. Many were recruited from art schools, advertising firms, and design companies in New York and Philadelphia. They included painters who would later become famous like Ellsworth Kelly, and designers like Bill Blass. Instead of creating ads or paintings, they were tasked with painting camouflage, setting up inflatable tanks, and designing illusions so convincing they could fool German reconnaissance. But this was no game. If discovered, the Ghost Army would have faced certain death. Armed with little more than pistols for protection, they walked into danger time after time with only rubber, paint, sound, and imagination as their weapons. For decades, their story remained classified. Even their families didn't know the truth of what they had done during the war. Only in recent years has the world begun to fully appreciate the scale of their courage and the brilliance of their deception. In this documentary, we will step into the world of the Ghost Army. We'll uncover how artists became warriors, how illusions reshaped the battlefield, and how this extraordinary unit, hidden in the shadows of World War II, left a legacy that continues to influence military deception to this day. This is not just the story of war, it's the story of imagination turned into a weapon. This is the Ghost Army of World War II.
Our next topic is the birth of the Ghost Army. The story of the Ghost Army begins not on the battlefield, but in the war rooms of Washington, D.C. and London. By 1943, the Allies were preparing for the greatest challenge of the war, the invasion of Nazi-occupied Europe. Every move mattered. Every mistake could cost thousands of lives, and the German military, highly trained, deeply entrenched, was watching every Allied step. The Allies needed more than firepower. They needed the element of surprise. The idea of military deception wasn't new. The British had already perfected clever tricks earlier in the war. During the North African campaign, they used fake tanks, dummy airfields, and misleading radio traffic to confuse German Field Marshal Erwin Rommel. The deception worked so well that it inspired American commanders to create a similar unit. The U.S. Army decided to assemble a special force dedicated entirely to tricking the enemy. This would not be a traditional combat unit, but a carefully crafted illusion. An entire division that could appear and disappear at will. Thus, in January 1944, the 23rd Headquarters Special Troops was born. The unit was unique from the very beginning. Unlike most military divisions, the Ghost Army was made up of only about 1,100 men, a fraction of a normal force. Their strength wasn't in numbers, but in creativity. The Army handpicked recruits from art schools, ad agencies, theaters, and even radio stations. Painters, architects, stage designers, and sound engineers suddenly found themselves in uniform. Many of these men had little experience with weapons, but they had something far more valuable: imagination. The 23rd was designed to function like a traveling roadshow of deception. It combined three main elements: visual deception, inflatable tanks, trucks, and artillery, creating the illusion of massive armored divisions. Sonic deception, giant loudspeakers broadcasting recordings of troop movements, convoys, and battle sounds. Radio deception, operators imitating real U.S. units, sending fake messages to mislead German intelligence. Together, these tricks could make 1,100 men appear to be 30,000 soldiers. Before the D-Day landings in June 1944, the Ghost Army was sent to Britain. There, they trained in absolute secrecy. They practiced inflating tanks in record time, learned to mimic the radio habits of real divisions, and recorded hours of engine noise, construction sounds, and even soldiers' conversations. By the time the Allies stormed the beaches of Normandy, the Ghost Army was ready. Their mission was simple but dangerous: to stand in for real American divisions, draw the enemy's attention, and protect the actual frontline soldiers by becoming targets themselves. It was a bold idea, an army that would fight with art, sound, and illusion. And soon this strange creation would be tested in the chaos of war. Unlikely soldiers, artists, designers, and sound engineers at war. When you think of a soldier, you imagine someone trained in combat, rifle in hand, hardened by drills, ready for battle. But the Ghost Army was different. Its ranks were filled not with warriors, but with dreamers. Men who once painted portraits, designed billboards, or mixed sound for theaters suddenly found themselves wearing U.S. Army uniforms. They were artists, turned into weapons. One of the most famous recruits was Bill Blass, a young fashion designer from Indiana. Before he would go on to dress presidents and Hollywood stars, Blass found himself sketching camouflage patterns and helping stage fake troop counts. Another was Ellsworth Kelly, who later became a renowned abstract painter. In the Ghost Army, his canvas wasn't paper or cloth. It was the European countryside, where he helped paint illusions that could fool German reconnaissance planes. Photographers, architects, set designers, even advertising illustrators. Each man brought a unique skill that proved invaluable in this strange theater of war. The Army deliberately recruited from art schools and creative circles. The Philadelphia Museum School of Industrial Art, the Art Students League of New York, and Yale's drama program all became unexpected pipelines into military service. Why? Because these men already knew how to manipulate perspective, color, sound, and attention. They were masters of illusion long before they put on helmets. One officer later joked, "It was as if the Army had raided Madison Avenue and Broadway. The Ghost Army was organized into specialized teams, each built around its members' talents. Visual section handled inflatable tanks, fake artillery, and camouflage artistry. They could set up a convincing battlefield scene in hours. Sonic section worked with engineers from Bell Labs to create recordings of tanks, trucks, and even troop chatter. With powerful speakers mounted on half-tracks, they could project sound up to 15 miles. Radio section. Skilled operators mimicked the radio fingerprints of real U.S. divisions, tricking German intelligence into believing entire units had moved. Special effects. Soldiers painted insignias on vehicles, staged campfires, and even acted as officers in nearby towns to spread misinformation. For many of these men, the Ghost Army felt less like a military unit and more like a traveling theater company. They weren't just hiding behind their illusions, they were acting them out. Soldiers would march in circles wearing different uniforms, giving the appearance of larger numbers. Artists forged official documents and painted division insignias onto trucks. Soundmen blasted recordings of construction work to suggest an entire base was being built overnight. It was all performance, but the stakes were deadly serious. Despite their unusual backgrounds, the men of the Ghost Army faced the same dangers as any soldier. They operated close to the front lines, sometimes just a few miles from German troops. If captured, their pistols and paintbrushes would be no match for enemy fire. Yet time and again, these unlikely soldiers stood their ground, armed not with heavy weapons, but with the power of imaginations. Move to next topic, that is weapons of illusion, inflatable tanks, fake radio, and sonic warfare. Every army has its weapons. For most, it's rifles, artillery, tanks, and planes. But for the Ghost Army, the arsenal was unlike anything the world had ever seen. Their weapons were made of rubber, sound, and imagination. The most iconic tool of the Ghost Army was the inflatable tank. At first glance, these decoys looked identical to real American Sherman tanks, complete with turrets, tracks, and barrels. From the air, a German pilot scouting the battlefield would swear he was looking at a heavily armed armored division. But in reality, a single soldier could pick up one of these tanks with his bare hands. Made of rubberized canvas, they could be inflated in less than 30 minutes using air compressors. Entire armored divisions, dozens of tanks, jeeps, trucks, and artillery, could be conjured overnight like a magician's trick. And when the mission was over, the soldiers deflated them, packed them up, and moved on to the next illusion. But visuals were only half the show. The Ghost Army also deployed sonic deception, one of the most innovative tricks of the war. Working with sound experts from Bell Laboratories, the unit recorded actual tanks, trucks, and soldiers at US training grounds. Every sound was cataloged: engine revs, gear shifts, hammering, voices, even the clatter of mess kits. Engineers then mixed these recordings into customized soundtracks for each mission. Mounted on massive loudspeakers, some as long as 15 feet, these recordings could be blasted across the countryside. To German ears, it sounded like a real division was on the move. Troops marching, convoys rolling, bridges being built, an entire battlefield, created out of sound. Then came the radio deception team. German intelligence relied heavily on monitoring Allied radio traffic. Every division had its own fingerprint, a unique rhythm and style of communication. The Ghost Army's skilled radio operators studied these patterns and imitated them perfectly. For days, they could send out fake transmissions, convincing the enemy that real American units had shifted location. Sometimes, the radio deception alone was enough to make the Germans redeploy troops, chasing divisions that didn't exist. To complete the illusion, the Ghost Army used special effects on the ground. Soldiers painted unit insignias on trucks, set up dummy camps with tents and laundry lines, and staged fake headquarters. Men dressed as generals strolled through villages, letting locals accidentally overhear false plans, knowing word would reach German ears. It was all part of a grand performance: visual, sonic, and psychological warfare working in harmony. Together, these methods allowed 1,100 men to impersonate entire divisions of 30,000 soldiers. The effect was so convincing that German commanders often moved entire units to counter these phantoms. And while the Ghost Army carried only pistols for defense, their illusions packed more power than bullets ever could. These weren't just tricks, they were life-saving weapons. Our next topic is deception on the battlefield. Major operations. By the summer of 1944, the Ghost Army was ready, trained in secrecy, armed with rubber tanks, sound effects, and fake radio traffic. These 1,100 men were about to test their illusions against the deadliest enemy of the war. Their stage, the battlefields of Europe. One of their earliest missions came in Brittany, France, during the Battle for Brest in August 1944. The German-held city was heavily fortified, and American forces needed to surround it. The Ghost Army's role was to pose as a large armored unit, distracting the Germans and drawing their fire. Inflatable tanks and artillery were set up in open fields, while sound trucks blasted the noise of engines and troops preparing for an assault. For days, the Germans directed artillery fire at the Ghost Army's positions, bombarding rubber tanks and empty foxholes. Every shell that landed on a decoy saved real American lives on the front lines. But their most famous mission came in March 1945 during Operation Viersen near the Rhine River in Germany. At that time, the Allies were preparing to cross the Rhine, a critical step toward invading the German heartland. The real crossing point had to remain a secret, so the Ghost Army created a full-scale illusion 10 miles away. They deployed over 1,000 inflatable vehicles, staged fake artillery positions, and broadcast the sounds of pontoon bridges being built. Radio operators sent out transmissions as if the U.S. 30th and 79th Divisions were preparing for a massive assault. German scouts reported the buildup. Believing the crossing would happen at the Ghost Army's location, the Germans shifted their forces there, leaving the real crossing point dangerously underdefended. On March 24, 1945, the Allies launched their actual assault elsewhere and crossed the Rhine successfully. The deception worked so perfectly that American commanders later credited the Ghost Army with saving thousands of lives in that single operation. Not every mission was on such a grand scale, but all carried immense risk. In Luxembourg, the Ghost Army once set up fake artillery close enough to the front that German patrols could stumble upon them at any moment. In another operation, soldiers painted insignias on trucks to impersonate the U.S. 6th Armored Division, then drove them through towns where spies were known to lurk. Every act was a gamble. If captured, they could have been executed as spies since they weren't fighting as conventional soldiers. Yet time and again, they pulled off their illusions, and the Germans took the bait. By the war's end, the Ghost Army had conducted more than 20 deception missions across France, Luxembourg, Belgium, and Germany. Each one bought the Allies valuable time, confused enemy intelligence, and saved lives on the battlefield. They weren't just supporting the war effort, in many cases, they were changing the outcome of battles without ever firing a shot. The next topic is risk and reality. What if they were caught? For all their clever tricks and inflatable tanks, the Ghost Army lived with a constant, terrifying truth. If they were discovered, they were as good as dead. Unlike infantry or armored units, the 23rd Headquarters Special Troops carried only light weapons. A few rifles, pistols, and machine guns, nothing that could stand against German tanks or artillery. Their real defense was secrecy. If the enemy realized they were an illusion, the deception would collapse, and the men could be slaughtered. Every mission placed the Ghost Army dangerously close to the front lines. They had to look convincing, and that meant setting up within range of German scouts, artillery, and air patrols. Imagine inflating a rubber Sherman tank in the middle of a field, knowing that just a few miles away, enemy spotters were searching for targets. One mistake, one misplaced prop, and the entire illusion could unravel. The Germans were skilled at detecting deception. Their reconnaissance units scoured for patterns, checking whether tire tracks matched the number of vehicles, whether campfires produced the right amount of smoke, whether radio signals sounded authentic. The Ghost Army had to think of everything. They carved fake tank tracks into the dirt with bulldozers. They lit the right number of campfires for a division of thousands. They even hung laundry on clotheslines, just so it looked like thousands of soldiers were living in camp. But even perfection could not erase the danger. In Luxembourg, during one operation, the Ghost Army set up so close to the front that German artillery began shelling their positions. Rubber tanks collapsed under the blasts, but the men stayed in place, knowing their job was to keep the enemy's focus on them, not the real divisions nearby. In another mission, soldiers disguised themselves as officers, strolling through villages where German spies were known to operate. They deliberately let slip false information, gambling that the enemy would believe them. If caught, they risked being executed as spies rather than treated as prisoners of war. The men of the Ghost Army lived in a strange world between war and theater. They had to laugh at the absurdity of carrying paintbrushes and air hoses into combat zones. But beneath the humor was fear, the knowledge that discovery could mean disaster. As one veteran later recalled, "We were a bunch of artists playing soldiers. If the Germans had ever realized it, we wouldn't have lasted 5 minutes." And yet, despite the risks, they succeeded. Not once did the Germans fully uncover the Ghost Army's secrets. Time and again, the illusions held, long enough to mislead the enemy and protect the real divisions. The danger was real, the stakes were high, and still, these unlikely soldiers carried out their missions with courage, knowing that their best weapon was not firepower, but deception. What was the impact of saving thousands of lives? Let's discuss it. In war, success is often measured in land gained, enemies defeated, or battles won. But the Ghost Army's success was measured in something far more precious: lives saved. The men of the 23rd Headquarters Special Troops may have carried rubber tanks and phonograph records, but their illusions often shifted the balance of entire campaigns. During the operation at Brest, their decoys absorbed relentless German artillery fire. Every shell that exploded on an inflatable tank was one less shell falling on real American soldiers fighting just miles away. In Luxembourg, their fake convoys tricked German forces into believing an armored division was massing nearby. The enemy diverted troops and supplies to counter a phantom, relieving pressure on U.S. infantry holding the line. And in Operation Viersen, perhaps their greatest triumph, the Ghost Army's deception along the Rhine, convinced German commanders that the main crossing would happen at their fake site. The enemy rushed reinforcements to the wrong place, leaving the true crossing point far less defended. When the Allies launched the assault, thousands of soldiers poured across the river with fewer casualties than expected. Historians later concluded that the Ghost Army may have saved tens of thousands of lives in that operation alone. The Ghost Army's work wasn't glamorous. There were no medals pinned to their chests, no newspaper headlines celebrating their victories. They operated in silence, their contributions hidden behind a curtain of secrecy. But ask the soldiers who lived because of them, and the impact becomes clear. Every day of confusion bought by the Ghost Army gave the Allies time to regroup, advance, or dig in. Every false radio message forced the Germans to hesitate. Every inflatable tank kept fire away from flesh and blood. Theirs was not a war of destruction, but of preservation. The impact extended beyond the battlefield. The Ghost Army demonstrated that creativity could be as deadly as any weapon. That deception, carefully planned and skillfully executed, could turn the tide of war without a single bullet fired. This principle influenced Allied strategy throughout Europe. Commanders came to trust the Ghost Army, calling on them whenever a risky maneuver needed protection. Their illusions became a shield, guarding divisions that might otherwise have been cut down in open combat. It is impossible to calculate the exact number of lives saved by the Ghost Army, but veterans and historians agree. Their deceptions prevented countless deaths. In a war defined by destruction, these 1,100 men fought a different kind of battle. A battle not for glory, but for survival. And because of their courage and ingenuity, thousands of American soldiers made it home who otherwise would not have. Recognition. Honoring the Ghost Army. For decades, the men of the Ghost Army remained unsung heroes. Their daring feats were hidden in classified files, their bravery unknown even to friends and family. But time, history, and research could not keep their story buried forever. Slowly, recognition began to arrive. In the early 1990s, historians and military enthusiasts started uncovering the incredible deceptions carried out by the 23rd Headquarters Special Troops. Photographs surfaced, soldiers standing next to inflatable tanks, tents arranged to simulate massive camps, and trucks painted to look like divisions of armored units. News articles and books began to highlight their unique contributions. The Ghost Army was no longer a secret. Their ingenuity, creativity, and courage were finally being celebrated. In 2007, the U.S. Army officially recognized the unit. Veterans were awarded the Meritorious Unit Commendation, acknowledging the Ghost Army's extraordinary service in the European theater. It was one of the first times the Army formally honored a unit whose primary weapon had been illusion rather than firepower. Many surviving veterans attended ceremonies decades after their missions, wearing medals they had never expected to receive. For some, it was a moment of validation. For others, it was a quiet acknowledgement that their unconventional bravery had mattered. Museums across the United States began displaying artifacts from the Ghost Army's missions. The National World War II Museum in New Orleans and the U.S. Army Center of Military History showcased inflatable tanks, sound equipment, and uniforms. Visitors could see firsthand the tools of deception that had saved thousands of lives during the war. Documentaries, films, and books further cemented the Ghost Army's legacy. Their story inspired not only military historians, but also artists, filmmakers, and writers intrigued by the fusion of creativity and strategy. Recognition also came from the veterans themselves. Many had spent years downplaying their work, believing it was a minor part of the war effort. But as historians pieced together the records, it became clear that the Ghost Army had played a vital role in several major operations, including the Rhine crossings and the battles for Brest and Luxembourg. They were more than performers, they were soldiers who risked everything with rubber tanks, painted tents, and recorded engine sounds. And now history was giving them their due. Today, the Ghost Army serves as a symbol of innovation, courage, and the power of the human mind in wartime. Their recognition reminds us that heroism is not always measured in bullets fired or enemy lines taken, but sometimes in cleverness, creativity, and the ability to save lives in ways no one expected. Through medals, exhibitions, and films, the world finally acknowledges what these men already knew. Their imagination had fought battles, protected comrades, and left an indelible mark on history. Last but not the least, let's discuss the silent heroes of World War II. The story of the Ghost Army is not one of firepower, medals, or fame. It is the story of imagination at war, of ordinary men who became extraordinary soldiers, not by shooting bullets, but by creating illusions that saved lives. For decades, their deeds were hidden, classified in dusty military archives, unknown even to their families. Yet, despite the silence, their impact on World War II was profound. They changed the battlefield without ever engaging in traditional combat. These 1,100 men, painters, designers, sound engineers, photographers, and actors, stepped into a world of danger, armed only with creativity. Inflatable tanks, fake artillery, soundtracks of phantom armies, and cleverly staged radio transmissions became their weapons. Through these tools, they tricked German commanders, protected real divisions, and saved countless lives. The Ghost Army demonstrated a truth rarely acknowledged in war. Brains can be as lethal as brawn. Strategy, deception, and ingenuity could achieve what raw firepower sometimes could not. They turned the battlefield into a canvas and imagination into a shield. Their legacy goes beyond World War II. Modern military deception, psychological operations, and electronic warfare all trace their roots back to the lessons of the Ghost Army. The idea that small, creative units can manipulate the perception of entire armies is a principle studied and applied in conflicts even today. But perhaps the most enduring legacy is human. The Ghost Army reminds us that heroism comes in many forms. Courage is not only running into bullets, it can be creating illusions, solving impossible problems, and risking everything to protect others without recognition. Recognition eventually came. From declassified files in the 1990s to the U.S. Army's Meritorious Unit Commendation in 2007, the world finally acknowledged their brilliance. Museums, documentaries, books, and exhibitions now tell the story of these silent heroes, ensuring their sacrifices and ingenuity are never forgotten. The Ghost Army may have fought in silence, but their story echoes across time. It is a testament to the power of creativity, the courage to innovate under pressure, and the ability of ordinary people to achieve extraordinary feats. In a war defined by destruction, they proved that life could be preserved through art, cunning, and imagination. As we look back on the battlefields of Europe, we remember not only the soldiers who fired the guns, but also the men who painted shadows of armies, projected phantom convoys, and orchestrated illusions that saved thousands of lives. They were unsung, invisible, and yet invaluable. The Ghost Army teaches us that true heroism often works behind the scenes, in quiet ingenuity and selfless courage. Their story is a reminder. Sometimes the most powerful weapon in war is the human mind. And for those who study the Ghost Army today, the lesson is clear. Creativity, bravery, and innovation can turn the tide of history, even without firing a single shot. That was the story of the Ghost Army of World War II, unsung heroes who proved that imagination can be just as powerful as any weapon. If you enjoyed this documentary, don't forget to like, share, and comment below. Tell us what part of their story amazed you the most. And for more incredible stories from history, make sure to subscribe to my channel and hit the notification bell. Here, every story has a secret, and every secret deserves to be told.